In the twilight hours of Veracruz, when the moon casts long shadows over the sparkling waters, there exists a story so quiet, yet so potent, that it has lingered for decades. Alejandro Serrano, a man often referred to in whispers, remains a figure wrapped in both mystery and reverence. Known only by a few as Shadow Ledger, his name evokes curiosity, and his actions, stealthy, precise, have shaped the criminal world of Veracruz like a quiet architect. Though he never sought the spotlight, his presence in the cartel's operations left an indelible mark, one that would echo through time. Veracruz itself is a place of contrasts, a coastal haven of breathtaking beauty intertwined with an undercurrent of danger. Its cobblestone streets echo with the footsteps of both the innocent and the guilty, while the ocean's relentless waves serve as a constant reminder of the power that lies beneath the surface. Alejandro's story is a testament to the dark allure of this city. While the world around him seemed to move with frantic energy, cartels clashing, alliances shifting, betrayals unfolding, he remained a calm observer, gathering knowledge in the silence of his well-calculated mind. Unlike many of the men who rose to power through violence and aggression, Alejandro's ascent was marked by an unnerving quietness. He was not the loud, boisterous figure who would capture headlines with fiery speeches or sudden acts of force. Instead, he was the one who lingered in the background, unnoticed by many, but always in control. He understood that true power is not in what is seen, but in what is hidden. His mastery over the world of organized crime was not defined by bloodshed but by strategy, manipulation, and, perhaps most notably, the power of silence. The nickname, Shadow Ledger, was given to him by those who had learned to respect him. The term ledger refers not just to the records he kept, detailed, precise, and ever-growing, but also to the way he kept track of every person, every transaction, every betrayal within the cartel. Like an invisible hand, he guided the cartel's movements with a sense of forethought and calculation that few could rival. While others used their strength to take what they wanted, Alejandro used his mind to predict what would happen next. His ability to foresee outcomes, to understand the intricacies of human behavior, and to know when to strike and when to wait, earned him not just respect, but fear. But what made Alejandro truly remarkable was his ability to remain in the background, always present yet never noticed. While his counterparts were busy battling for control, making headlines, and establishing their dominance, he remained a shadow. He understood that in a world where everyone is looking to take the throne, it is often the quiet observer who truly holds the power. And so, while others fought in the streets, Alejandro waged wars in the minds of those around him. In the early days, very few realized the extent of his influence. He wasn't a man who made grand speeches or took up arms in visible battle. Instead, he would be the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes, ensuring that his allies remained loyal, his rivals kept guessing, and his enemies were always one step behind. Every decision, every move he made was deliberate, quietly positioning him as one of the most powerful figures within the Veracruz circle, though his name was barely known. His ability to see the long game was unmatched. While other leaders focused on the immediate, Alejandro was always thinking several steps ahead. He knew that time was a powerful ally in the world of organized crime, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. In this world of constant upheaval, where loyalty was fleeting and alliances could dissolve in an instant, he understood that patience, calculated patience, would always win out. And so he waited, and when the time was right, he acted with a precision that left no room for error. As the years passed, whispers began to spread. The Shadow Ledger was more than just a man behind the curtain, he was a myth, a ghost, and a force to be reckoned with. The legend of his intelligence, his ability to outmaneuver even the most ruthless leaders, grew to such proportions that it became impossible to separate fact from fiction. Some said he could predict the future, others claimed he had eyes everywhere. And while many in the cartel feared him, there were others who admired him for the very qualities that made him such an enigma: his calm demeanor, his measured approach, his unwavering focus on building something lasting, something stable in a world of constant chaos. Despite his influence, Alejandro's desire for the spotlight was non-existent. His power wasn't built on the notoriety that often accompanies criminal figures. Instead, it was built on trust, control, and foresight. Alejandro understood the delicate balance of power in the cartel world, how to rise without attracting too much attention, how to stay in the shadows while pulling the levers that determined the fate of many. For the first few years, Alejandro's role was largely unseen. The true extent of his influence only became clear later on, as the Veracruz Circle's empire grew, its operations expanding quietly under his careful direction. He was not the violent kingpin who ruled through fear, but the steady hand that kept the wheels turning. His story is not one of bloodshed and grandiose acts of defiance, but one of quiet persistence, of knowing when to act and when to remain still. In a world where power is often defined by noise and violence, Alejandro Serrano's story offers a unique contrast. His legacy, shaped by intelligence rather than brute force, stands as a testament to the power of patience, control, and the quiet pursuit of greatness. His name may not be shouted from the rooftops, but in the shadowy corridors of the Veracruz Circle, it echoes with a resonance that few can ignore. Alejandro Serrano's early years in Veracruz were defined by the deep contrasts of his environment. The city, perched on Mexico's Gulf Coast, was a place of breathtaking beauty, an alluring coastline with golden sands and lush landscapes, but beneath its picturesque exterior was a world of gritty struggle, danger, and corruption. It was in this volatile mix that Alejandro's story began to take shape. His family, though not wealthy, was deeply rooted in the culture of Veracruz, with connections that would later prove invaluable as he navigated the treacherous world of organized crime. However, Alejandro's path would not be defined by the same aggressive nature that dominated the lives of many in his community. Instead, his rise would be marked by quiet ambition and a keen sense of observation. From an early age, Alejandro was different. Where others were loud and eager to gain attention, he was reserved and contemplative. While other children ran through the streets, playing games of chance or getting caught up in the hustle of the world around them, Alejandro stayed to the edges, watching. His quiet nature was often mistaken for shyness, but in truth, it was the beginning of something much more profound, an ability to observe and learn without revealing his intentions. He watched as the world around him was shaped by power, power forged in violence, in money, in threats, and began to understand that the greatest currency in Veracruz was not gold or silver, but control. His parents, while not part of the criminal world themselves, had their own deep-set survival instincts. They knew that the streets of Veracruz were not kind to those who were naive, and they did what they could to shield their children from the worst of it. But in a place like Veracruz, innocence is often a fleeting thing. Alejandro quickly learned that the world he had been born into was filled with layers of power struggles, corrupt officials, and criminal forces that ran deep beneath the surface of everyday life. It wasn't long before he was exposed to the realities of his environment, not through the violence and chaos, but through the quiet undercurrents of influence. By the time he was a teenager, Alejandro had already begun to understand the hidden mechanisms of the criminal world. He had seen firsthand how people rose and fell, how alliances were forged in secrecy, and how the most powerful figures were often the ones who kept their actions behind closed doors. He witnessed the clashes between the rival cartels, each vying for control of Veracruz's lucrative drug routes, arms trade, and other illicit activities. In this chaotic dance, it was the quiet ones, the thinkers, the strategists, the planners, who thrived. Alejandro knew that if he wanted to make his mark, it would not be through open confrontation, but through subtle maneuvering, outsmarting his rivals without them even realizing it. His first foray into the criminal world wasn't dramatic or explosive. He didn't engage in violent acts or attempt to make a name for himself in the way that many others did. Instead, he made his initial connections quietly. He listened. He learned. Alejandro became a trusted ally for a small but powerful faction within the Veracruz Circle. He offered no flashy displays of power, instead, he provided something far more valuable: information. His ability to gather intelligence, observing, remembering, and connecting dots that others overlooked, began to set him apart from the more impulsive members of the cartel. One of Alejandro's early mentors was a mid-level figure in the Veracruz Circle, a man who recognized his potential for strategic thinking. This mentor, a shrewd and calculating figure himself, taught Alejandro the value of patience. He emphasized the importance of knowing when to act and when to bide time. "The quieter you are, the more they listen," he would often say, a lesson Alejandro took to heart. This wisdom would become a cornerstone of Alejandro's approach to life within the cartel, the idea that power did not always come from force or noise, but from understanding the rhythms of the world around you and moving with it, never against it. As Alejandro entered adulthood, his reputation began to grow, not for any one dramatic act, but for the quiet consistency with which he navigated the world of crime. While others around him tried to carve their names into the history of Veracruz through bloodshed or loud gestures, Alejandro's influence grew through relationships and trust. He became known as someone who could be relied upon to keep secrets, to handle delicate matters with care, and, perhaps most importantly, to never reveal his true intentions. His ability to stay under the radar while amassing knowledge and understanding of the cartel's intricate power structures was, in itself, a remarkable feat. Despite his growing influence, Alejandro never allowed himself to be drawn into the more outwardly glamorous aspects of the criminal lifestyle. He didn't surround himself with luxuries or demand respect in the way that others did. He didn't need to. His strength lay in his ability to operate in the shadows, to remain unseen while shaping events around him. He understood that true power is often not in what is visible, but in what is hidden from view. This gave him an edge over others. He was not only building his own position but positioning others around him to serve his interests. As the years passed, Alejandro's role within the Veracruz circle deepened. He became indispensable, but always remained in the background. While the more flamboyant leaders of the cartel would take center stage, Alejandro's contributions were felt in the decisions made behind closed doors, decisions that often determined the fate of the cartel. His careful management of information and resources began to shift the power dynamics within the organization. And yet, he remained a ghost, a figure whose name was barely spoken but whose influence was felt in every corner of the cartel's operations. By the time Alejandro reached adulthood, Veracruz had already begun to see the rise of new forces within the cartel world, new alliances being forged and new rivalries emerging. However, where others saw conflict, Alejandro saw opportunity. He understood that conflict, when handled correctly, could lead to the creation of something greater. His ability to stay calm in the midst of chaos, to keep his own counsel while the world around him fell into disarray, gave him a sense of clarity that was rare among his peers. And it was this clarity, this ability to see the long game, that would one day propel him to a position of unimaginable power. In those early days, Alejandro's path wasn't always clear. But even as he moved through the shadows, even as he played his part in the great machinations of the cartel, one thing was always certain: Alejandro Serrano was not someone to be underestimated. His quiet rise was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would see him become a central figure in the Veracruz circle's complex web of power. His childhood, spent in the quiet corners of Veracruz, was the foundation for a future that would be anything but silent. As Alejandro Serrano entered the world of organized crime, he quickly realized that it wasn't enough to simply observe, it was time to act. His early steps were cautious, carefully calculated. His natural talents for strategy and observation had already gained him respect among a select few within the Veracruz circle, but now he had to prove that he could hold his own in a world dominated by ruthless violence and cutthroat ambition. Unlike many who rushed into criminal acts with reckless abandon, Alejandro moved with measured intent. His first crimes were not born out of desperation or the thirst for power, but rather the need to demonstrate his capability within the brutal hierarchy of the cartel. It started small. Alejandro's initial foray into the criminal world involved low-level tasks, tasks that allowed him to prove himself without drawing unnecessary attention. He became involved in the smuggling operations that were central to the Veracruz circle's activities. These operations, often under the cover of darkness, moved everything from contraband to weapons, drugs to human trafficking. Alejandro quickly learned the intricacies of these operations, how to move product without being detected, how to deal with border officials, and, most importantly, how to manage the delicate relationships with various underworld contacts who facilitated the cartel's business. His efficiency, his ability to remain calm under pressure, and his knack for understanding the flow of transactions quickly made him indispensable to the cartel's higher-ups. Though his involvement in these early crimes was largely logistical, Alejandro began to see how power was built in the cartel world, not just through violent acts, but through the control of information, territory, and alliances. It wasn't enough to simply execute a job well. Alejandro understood that the true influence lay in who controlled the flow of goods and who held the loyalty of those involved. What made him stand out was his ability to read people, his understanding of motivations and weaknesses. He knew that trust in this world was often fleeting, but if he could leverage his knowledge of others' desires, he could carve out a space for himself that wasn't easily shaken. His rise within the Veracruz circle was swift, but it was by no means smooth. There were moments of tension, moments where Alejandro was forced to navigate the dangers of the underworld in ways that would test his mettle. On one such occasion, he was tasked with handling a shipment of cocaine from a rival cartel. The operation was risky, a betrayal could mean instant death, but Alejandro approached the task with the same precision that had guided his every move. He meticulously planned the route, double-checked every detail, and ensured that each person involved understood their role. When the shipment was delivered without incident, and the money changed hands, Alejandro had proven not only his capability but his potential for greater responsibility. However, his success did not go unnoticed. In the cutthroat world of organized crime, rising too quickly can be just as dangerous as remaining stagnant. Alejandro's quiet rise was met with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Those who saw him as a rising star took note of his calculated demeanor, his cool-headed decisions, and his sharp intellect. But there were others who saw him as a threat. In a world where loyalty was constantly tested, anyone who gained too much influence was a target. Alejandro knew this all too well. He understood that the true test of power wasn't just about gaining respect, it was about maintaining it. One of the first moments where Alejandro's resolve was truly tested came when he was thrust into a violent power struggle between two factions within the cartel. A dispute over territory had escalated, and it seemed inevitable that blood would be spilled. But Alejandro, ever the tactician, saw an opportunity to emerge stronger. Rather than engage in open conflict, which would risk his carefully constructed position, he used his understanding of the faction leader's desires and weaknesses to broker a quiet peace. Through a series of subtle negotiations and well-timed actions, he managed to ease tensions between the two factions, ensuring that both sides were satisfied without a single shot being fired. It was this ability to navigate complex, dangerous situations without resorting to violence that would define his future in the cartel. In the eyes of many, Alejandro was quickly becoming someone not to be crossed. But despite his growing influence, he remained cautious, never allowing himself to be too visible, too vocal. His ability to keep his cards close to his chest became one of his greatest strengths. In the criminal world, where everyone was always jockeying for power, Alejandro's calm demeanor and strategic thinking made him a formidable figure. He knew that every move, every decision, had to be part of a larger plan. His ambition was not for immediate recognition but for long-term power, a power that could only be achieved through careful manipulation and a willingness to wait for the right moment. As the cartel's operations expanded, so did Alejandro's role within it. His influence was no longer confined to the logistics of the smuggling routes. He began to oversee larger operations, dealing directly with suppliers and managing more complex transactions. His ability to keep everything running smoothly, to manage both the practical aspects of the cartel's business and the human element of trust and loyalty, made him invaluable. But it also made him a target. As Alejandro's role grew, so did the number of enemies who saw him as a threat to their own ambitions. One of Alejandro's greatest strengths was his ability to stay one step ahead of his rivals. He learned early on that in the world of organized crime, nothing was ever as it seemed. Alliances were fluid, and people who seemed like allies could turn on you at any moment. It was this recognition that led Alejandro to cultivate a network of informants, loyal eyes and ears within rival factions who kept him informed of any developments that could threaten his position. While other cartel members relied on brute force, Alejandro's strength lay in his ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies. He was a master of anticipation, always aware of the shifting currents of power around him. By the time Alejandro reached his early 20s, his reputation had spread across Veracruz. No longer just a low-level operator, he had become an integral part of the Veracruz circle's inner workings. Yet, even as he gained more power and influence, he continued to operate in the shadows, never seeking the spotlight, never demanding recognition. His rise was deliberate, slow, and silent, an evolution that would one day make him one of the most powerful figures within the cartel, but for now, he was content to let his actions speak for themselves. His first crimes, though relatively minor compared to the legacy he would later build, were crucial steps on the path to his eventual dominance. They were the foundation upon which Alejandro would build his empire. And through each step, whether it was the careful negotiation of a dangerous shipment or the quiet resolution of internal conflict, he proved that power could be obtained not just through violence, but through foresight, patience, and precision. As Alejandro Serrano's influence within the Veracruz circle continued to grow, so did the complexity of the world around him. What had once been a quiet existence, observing the power struggles and machinations of those around him, had now evolved into a game of high-stakes strategy. With each passing year, Alejandro found himself more deeply entrenched in the cartel's inner workings, forced to make decisions that would shape not only his own future but the future of the entire organization. He was no longer a shadow figure, working behind the scenes, he was becoming a key player in the cartel's vast empire, and with that came both immense power and the ever-present threat of danger. It was at this point that Alejandro's true talent for leadership began to emerge. While many of his counterparts were focused on violent expansion, territorial disputes, drug wars, and taking control of lucrative new markets, Alejandro approached the cartel's expansion with a unique perspective. He understood that growth in the criminal world wasn't just about brute force. It was about control, consistency, and the careful management of relationships. In his eyes, power was a delicate web, and the more connections he made, the more firmly entrenched he became within the cartel's ecosystem. His first major test of leadership came when a rival cartel, one with a history of aggression and territorial expansion, began encroaching on Veracruz's operations. The cartel, led by a ruthless and hot-headed boss, was attempting to push into the lucrative drug routes that Alejandro had helped establish. In the past, conflicts like this would have resulted in a full-scale war, with both sides battling it out for control of key territories. But Alejandro, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity to leverage the situation to his advantage. Instead of diving into violent confrontation, Alejandro devised a plan to undermine the rival cartel from within. He knew that a direct confrontation would lead to bloodshed, destabilizing the region and drawing attention from law enforcement. Instead, he began to sow discord within the rival cartel itself. Using his extensive network of informants, Alejandro gained insight into the internal tensions and rivalries that existed within the rival faction. There were cracks within their leadership, petty jealousies, and ambitious underlings who were eager to seize power. Alejandro used these weaknesses to his advantage, feeding misinformation, exploiting divisions, and subtly turning members of the rival cartel against each other. As the rival cartel's internal strife grew, Alejandro quietly strengthened his position, securing alliances with key players in Veracruz who were disillusioned with the violent and chaotic tactics of the rival faction. His careful diplomacy, combined with his ability to read people and anticipate their moves, allowed him to consolidate power without ever having to fire a shot. By the time the rival cartel realized that their plans were falling apart, Alejandro had already secured his dominance in the region. The lesson was clear: Alejandro was not just a survivor in the criminal world, he was a master tactician who could turn any situation to his advantage, even without resorting to violence. This victory solidified Alejandro's place within the Veracruz circle. His reputation as a leader who could navigate the complex and ever-changing landscape of organized crime was now firmly established. He had proven that true power didn't lie in brute force, it lay in the ability to manipulate, to control the flow of information, and to outthink those around you. His ability to remain calm under pressure, to make decisions that others couldn't see coming, made him a force to be reckoned with. But as Alejandro's power grew, so did the risks. The higher one rises in the criminal world, the more enemies one accumulates. And as Alejandro continued to outmaneuver his rivals, he drew the attention of those who would stop at nothing to bring him down. This was a reality that Alejandro understood all too well. He knew that the higher he climbed, the more visible he became, and the more likely he was to become a target for those who saw him as a threat to their own ambitions. But Alejandro, with his calm demeanor and sharp mind, was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. One of the most dangerous moments in Alejandro's rise to power came when a former ally, someone he had once trusted, betrayed him. This individual, a powerful figure within the Veracruz circle, saw Alejandro's growing influence as a threat to his own position and decided to make a move against him. The betrayal was swift, but Alejandro, ever the strategist, was prepared. He had anticipated that someone might eventually try to undermine him, and he had already set the wheels in motion to neutralize the threat before it could fully materialize. The betrayal came in the form of a setup, a trap designed to frame Alejandro for a crime he didn't commit. It was a classic maneuver in the world of organized crime: turn an ally into an enemy, use the legal system to discredit them, and eliminate them as a rival. But Alejandro's intelligence, foresight, and his extensive network of informants allowed him to turn the tables. He knew that to survive in the cartel world, you couldn't just rely on your own actions, you had to have eyes everywhere, people who would alert you to danger before it struck. Alejandro's web of contacts and his ability to stay several steps ahead allowed him to expose the betrayal before it could cause any significant damage. Once again, Alejandro emerged victorious, but the lesson was not lost on him: trust, in the criminal world, was a fragile thing. Even the closest allies could betray you if it suited their interests. But rather than retaliating with violence, Alejandro took a more calculated approach. He eliminated the threat, yes, but he also used the betrayal to his advantage. He turned the situation into an opportunity to further cement his power, to prove to both his allies and enemies alike that he was untouchable, not just because of his strength, but because of his ability to outmaneuver anyone who tried to cross him. As the years passed, Alejandro's role within the Veracruz circle continued to expand. He was no longer just a trusted lieutenant or a behind-the-scenes strategist, he was becoming the mastermind behind the cartel's operations. He controlled vast territories, dictated the flow of goods, and had a hand in every major decision that was made. But Alejandro's true power lay in his ability to stay in the background, to remain an enigma while pulling the strings that controlled the lives of those around him. He understood that in the world of organized crime, it wasn't enough to be feared, you had to be respected, and more importantly, you had to be indispensable. Through his careful rise, Alejandro had come to understand the delicate balance between power and paranoia. Every success was tempered with the awareness that those around him were constantly assessing his strength, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. But Alejandro, ever the patient strategist, knew that it wasn't about avoiding risks, it was about managing them, navigating through the dangers with precision and grace. And as he continued to rise, Alejandro knew that he was no longer just a shadow figure, he was the architect of the Veracruz circle's future, and nothing, not even betrayal, would stop him from achieving his ultimate goal. As Alejandro Serrano's reputation within the Veracruz circle continued to flourish, his influence spread far beyond the quiet corridors of the cartel's operations. He had evolved into something more than just a strategic mastermind, he had become an essential fixture within the cartel's hierarchy. His name was whispered with reverence, yet also with fear, by those who knew his true power. But with this elevated status came an undeniable truth: no matter how carefully one navigated the world of organized crime, the risk of exposure and downfall was always lurking just around the corner. Alejandro, ever the strategist, was acutely aware of the dangers that came with his growing prominence. His ability to maintain control over vast regions, to ensure smooth and profitable operations, and to eliminate threats with calculated precision had earned him the loyalty of his closest allies. However, such power always came with a price. He understood that the greater one's influence, the more enemies they inevitably accumulate. And in the criminal underworld, enemies didn't always strike directly. Sometimes, the greatest threats were the subtle, insidious forces working behind the scenes, those who sought to undermine you in ways that left no trace. One of the first signs that Alejandro's position was being challenged came when whispers of a new, ambitious faction began circulating through the Veracruz circle. This faction, led by a charismatic and ruthless figure, sought to take control of the cartel's operations in the northern regions. The leader of this faction, known only as El Lobo, was gaining support among the younger members of the cartel, individuals who were hungry for power and eager for a new order. They viewed Alejandro's approach, calm, measured, and above all, non-violent, as outdated, a relic of a bygone era. To them, El Lobo's more aggressive and flashy style was what the cartel needed to continue growing. For the first time in years, Alejandro felt the tremors of a true threat to his power. He had always been able to outthink his rivals, to manipulate situations in his favor, but this was different. El Lobo's faction represented a new wave of violence and chaos, a style of leadership that threatened to disrupt the careful balance Alejandro had worked so hard to maintain. His strategy of avoiding open confrontation and relying on subtlety now seemed vulnerable to the reckless aggression of El Lobo's followers. Alejandro knew that if this new faction were allowed to gain traction, it could erode the very foundation of the Veracruz circle. The cartel had thrived under his leadership because it had been built on trust, loyalty, and the careful orchestration of power. But El Lobo and his followers viewed these principles as weaknesses. They believed that true power came from overwhelming force, intimidation, and the ability to make quick, decisive moves. Alejandro, in contrast, had always understood that power was not about dominance in the short term but control over time, outlasting your enemies, undermining their positions, and waiting for the right moment to strike. In order to neutralize the threat that El Lobo posed, Alejandro needed to be both ruthless and patient. He couldn't afford to engage in a direct confrontation with El Lobo's faction, as this would only fuel the fire and risk splitting the cartel in two. Instead, Alejandro used his knowledge of El Lobo's ambitions to create a series of subtle divisions within the faction itself. By leveraging his extensive network of informants, Alejandro was able to plant seeds of doubt among the younger, more impressionable members of El Lobo's group. He played on their fears, whispered about El Lobo's true intentions, and exploited the rivalries that existed within the faction. But Alejandro's genius lay not only in his manipulation of El Lobo's followers but also in his ability to maintain his own position as a neutral figure. He was no longer just a strategist, he had become a symbol of stability within the cartel. His calm demeanor, his quiet power, and his ability to broker peace in times of chaos made him an invaluable asset. Alejandro positioned himself as the mediator between the factions, the one who could restore balance if things ever escalated too far. In this way, he made himself indispensable, no one within the cartel could afford to ignore him, not even El Lobo. As months passed, Alejandro's careful manipulation began to show results. El Lobo's faction began to fracture. The once united group became divided, with different members questioning their leader's motives and methods. At the same time, Alejandro strengthened his alliances with the more established, influential members of the cartel, ensuring that they remained loyal to him. He made it clear that the Veracruz circle could not afford to be led by someone like El Lobo, someone whose short-term thinking and thirst for power could unravel everything that had been built. The pressure on El Lobo began to mount. His supporters grew disillusioned with his inability to maintain unity and began to look for more reliable leaders. Alejandro, knowing that the tide was turning in his favor, waited patiently for the right moment to strike. The opportunity came when El Lobo, desperate to assert his authority, made a critical mistake. He moved to eliminate one of Alejandro's most trusted allies, a man who had been instrumental in maintaining control over the cartel's operations in the south. Alejandro acted swiftly and decisively. He used his influence to gather the support of the cartel's most powerful leaders, ensuring that they backed his decision to remove El Lobo from power. Within days, El Lobo's faction had collapsed, and Alejandro had emerged victorious once again. He didn't have to spill blood to achieve his goal. Instead, he used his intellect, his ability to read people, and his understanding of the cartel's delicate power dynamics to outmaneuver his rival. In the aftermath, Alejandro solidified his control over the cartel. The younger members, disillusioned by El Lobo's failure, were brought under his wing. He offered them a vision of the future, one where power was exercised not through force but through careful, calculated leadership. Alejandro's rise was now complete. He had not only neutralized a dangerous rival, but he had also proven that his vision for the Veracruz Circle was the one that would ensure its survival and growth. But Alejandro's success came with a price. In the wake of El Lobo's downfall, there were whispers of resentment. Some viewed Alejandro's handling of the situation as too calculated, too manipulative. They saw him as a puppet master, pulling strings from behind the scenes, never fully revealing his true intentions. And while Alejandro had won this battle, he knew that in the world of organized crime, such victories were always temporary. Power was a fragile thing, and there were always others who would rise up, seeking to challenge him. But for now, Alejandro remained the undisputed leader of the Veracruz Circle, his influence unchallenged, his position secure. He had weathered yet another storm, and his enemies were left wondering, just how long could Alejandro Serrano remain untouchable? The downfall of El Lobo was a turning point for Alejandro Serrano, but it was also a reminder that in the world of organized crime, power is never truly secure. Even as he solidified his leadership within the Veracruz Circle, Alejandro understood the fundamental truth of his world: stability was always temporary. New challenges were constantly emerging, and the more power one accumulated, the more exposed they became to threats, both from within and outside their organization. Alejandro's next major test came in the form of a challenge that he had always feared, but never truly anticipated. While his dominance within the cartel was unquestioned, Alejandro's methods of control, calm, patient, strategic, had not been without their detractors. There were still factions within the Veracruz Circle that viewed him with suspicion, not out of a desire for power, but because of his unconventional approach. He wasn't the kind of leader who flaunted his authority through sheer force. He wasn't a tyrant or a warlord. His quiet leadership style, while effective, left a lingering question in the minds of some: how could they truly trust a man who preferred manipulation and subtlety over raw violence? This undercurrent of doubt was about to surface in a way that Alejandro hadn't foreseen. The first sign came when a former ally, someone who had been with him from the very beginning, began to question Alejandro's loyalty to the circle. Luis El Coyote Morales, a longtime member of the cartel's elite and one of Alejandro's closest confidants, began to openly criticize Alejandro's leadership. At first, it seemed like the kind of disagreement that could easily be smoothed over. But as time passed, it became clear that El Coyote was not just disgruntled, he was plotting. What was most dangerous about Luis's rebellion wasn't that it was overt, but that it was subtle. Luis wasn't rallying a large group of disillusioned cartel members to his side. Instead, he was quietly sowing distrust, whispering in the ears of those around him that Alejandro had become too complacent, too detached from the day-to-day operations of the cartel. He claimed that Alejandro was no longer the leader he had once been, that his cautious nature had become a liability. For many in the cartel, these words began to resonate. The younger generation, those who had grown up with the expectation of hard power and quick rewards, were starting to see Alejandro's approach as outdated. What made this betrayal all the more dangerous was how well-planned it was. Luis had been a loyal ally for years. His connections within the cartel ran deep, and his influence over certain key players was significant. Alejandro, ever observant, noticed the subtle shifts in the cartel's dynamics. He noticed how some of his closest allies began to distance themselves, not through overt defiance, but through quiet indifference. Meetings that once had a clear structure became chaotic, with members of the cartel openly questioning decisions that Alejandro had made in the past. Luis, in the shadows, was orchestrating a quiet coup, eroding the support that Alejandro had so carefully cultivated. For the first time in years, Alejandro found himself facing a situation that was not about direct confrontation but about perception. He could no longer rely solely on his tactical brilliance. His next move would require something different, a shift in how he positioned himself within the cartel. The power of leadership, Alejandro realized, lay not just in making decisions, but in maintaining the illusion of invulnerability. If people began to see him as weak, as someone who could be challenged, then his position would inevitably erode. This realization brought Alejandro back to his roots. He understood that he had never risen to the top of the Veracruz circle through violence alone. His true strength had always been in his ability to understand the motivations of others, to predict their moves before they made them, and to turn even the most subtle threat into an advantage. This was not a time for direct action, it was a time for subtlety, for returning to the strategic games that had once defined his rise. The first step in Alejandro's plan was to undermine Luis's credibility. He knew that a direct confrontation with Luis would be disastrous. Luis had too many loyal supporters, and an open conflict would divide the cartel at a time when unity was crucial. Instead, Alejandro began to quietly discredit Luis among the cartel's leadership. He used his network of informants to plant rumors about Luis's motivations, suggesting that his actions were not just about leadership, but about personal ambition. Alejandro implied that Luis's discontent was not rooted in a desire to make the cartel stronger, but in a hunger for power that would ultimately lead to betrayal. Simultaneously, Alejandro began to reaffirm his own position as the indispensable leader of the Veracruz circle. He took steps to reinforce his reputation as the one who had brought stability to the cartel, the one who had steered it through turbulent times. He made strategic moves that demonstrated his continued relevance. He secured new, profitable business deals, expanded the cartel's influence into new territories, and successfully navigated an increasing amount of law enforcement pressure. Each success was a calculated message to the cartel's leadership. Alejandro was still the mastermind, still the man who could keep things running smoothly. Alejandro's efforts to counteract Luis's influence did not go unnoticed. The cartel's leadership began to shift once again, with many leaders, who had once been loyal to Luis, beginning to reconsider their positions. They began to see Alejandro as the figure of stability in a sea of uncertainty. It became increasingly clear that Luis's rebellion, while still covert, was starting to falter. The cracks in his movement were widening, and his influence over the younger members of the cartel was beginning to diminish. But Alejandro knew that the battle wasn't over. He understood that in the criminal world, appearances were everything. A leader who looked vulnerable, even for a moment, could quickly become a target. Alejandro's strategy now was not only to defeat Luis but to ensure that no one would ever again question his authority. He needed to remind the Veracruz circle that his leadership was not only effective but essential. The cartel had thrived under his rule because of his vision, his patience, and his ability to outsmart his enemies at every turn. This was a moment to reassert his dominance, to ensure that no one, inside or outside the cartel, could ever forget who was truly in charge. In the weeks that followed, Alejandro's calculated moves began to bear fruit. Luis's supporters began to dwindle, and the faction that had once threatened Alejandro's power now began to collapse. By the time the full extent of Luis's betrayal became apparent, Alejandro had already positioned himself as the undeniable leader of the cartel. His enemies, once bold in their defiance, were now left with nothing but the realization that they had underestimated the quiet architect of the Veracruz circle. But Alejandro had not emerged unscathed. The quiet coup had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It reminded him that in the world of organized crime, the greatest threat often came not from external forces, but from those who were closest to you. As he looked out over the smoldering remnants of the rebellion, Alejandro couldn't help but wonder, in a world built on trust and betrayal, how long could anyone truly remain at the top? And more importantly, could anyone ever trust another soul again? Despite Alejandro Serrano's victory over Luis, El Coyote, Morales and the apparent stability he had restored within the Veracruz circle, the nature of the criminal world meant that peace was always fleeting. As Alejandro consolidated his power and strengthened his position, the weight of his success began to manifest in subtle, yet profound ways. He had always understood that power, in any form, was inherently fragile, but even the most seasoned leaders can be blindsided by the complexities of the underworld. For Alejandro, his next challenge would come not in the form of another overt challenge to his leadership, but from the growing instability that was happening on the international stage. The world outside the cartel's immediate sphere of influence was beginning to change rapidly. As the United States and Mexico ramped up their efforts to combat organized crime, law enforcement strategies became more sophisticated, and resources dedicated to the fight against cartels were being funneled into intelligence gathering and covert operations. Federal authorities, now more coordinated than ever, had shifted their focus from taking down small-time operators to targeting high-level cartel leadership. Alejandro had always been careful to keep a low profile, but his prominence within the Veracruz circle made him an unavoidable target. At first, Alejandro dismissed these external threats as distant problems, an inconvenience, yes, but not something that would truly jeopardize his position. He had faced law enforcement heat before and had always emerged unscathed. His ability to manipulate situations in his favor and his extensive network of insiders within various governmental agencies had protected him up until that point. However, the pressure was mounting, and Alejandro's calculated indifference began to crack. The first signs of the growing external threat were the sudden increase in law enforcement raids across cartel-controlled territories. For years, Alejandro's meticulous management of his operations had kept the authorities at bay, but now, an unnerving frequency of federal agents seemed to be closing in on the cartel's business interests. While some of these operations were minor, others were increasingly strategic, targeting key shipments, distribution routes, and money laundering operations. Alejandro realized that it was no longer enough to keep a low profile. The cartel was being systematically squeezed, and it was only a matter of time before their success would attract full-scale military intervention. At the same time, rival cartels, sensing weakness in the Veracruz circle, began to press in from the peripheries. Alejandro had always held a delicate balance within his cartel, but other powerful groups, particularly the Gulf Cartel, were beginning to encroach on Veracruz's traditional strongholds. The Gulf Cartel, emboldened by its own expansion in the region, had started making moves into the areas Alejandro controlled, seeking to capitalize on his cartel's temporary vulnerabilities. The mere idea of an intercartel war was a nightmare. Alejandro had worked tirelessly to avoid such conflicts, knowing how quickly the bloody rivalries could spiral out of control. War with another cartel would not only undermine his leadership but would also invite the full attention of both Mexican authorities and U.S. law enforcement. This was precisely the kind of heat he had always worked to avoid, yet it was becoming increasingly clear that such a war might be unavoidable. The question now wasn't if a war would happen, but when, and how could Alejandro maintain control in the midst of chaos? Alejandro began to shift his approach. Where once he had been content to stay largely in the shadows, managing his empire from behind the scenes, he now knew that he would have to take more direct action to ensure the survival of the Veracruz circle. His calm demeanor, once his greatest strength, was now a potential liability. To survive in this shifting landscape, Alejandro would need to become more active in the day-to-day operations. He could no longer afford to wait for threats to come to him, he had to strike preemptively. But he knew that direct confrontation with rival cartels could lead to open warfare, and open warfare could mean a complete unraveling of his empire. Thus, Alejandro turned to the one resource he trusted above all others, his intellect. The key to surviving in the ever-shifting landscape of organized crime, he realized, was the ability to adapt quickly, to anticipate changes in the environment, and to make bold, calculated decisions in the face of mounting pressure. Alejandro's new strategy would involve not only securing his cartel's interests but also manipulating the situation to his advantage by exploiting the emerging cracks in both the law enforcement efforts and the rival cartels. First, Alejandro called on his vast network of informants, not just within Mexico, but also across the U.S., and even within various government agencies. His contacts had always been his eyes and ears, providing critical intelligence on police movements, rival cartel activities, and political shifts. This time, however, Alejandro instructed them to dig deeper, to find out what was motivating the recent intensification of raids and law enforcement operations. His intuition told him that the U.S. government, in particular, was ramping up its efforts not only due to the growing violence and drug trade but because it had come to understand just how interconnected the Veracruz Circle was with the international network of organized crime. The cartel's reach wasn't just regional, it spanned continents. Using this intelligence, Alejandro began to pull at the threads of law enforcement operations. He started using misinformation to confuse and misdirect authorities, feeding them false leads about cartel operations and routes, causing them to waste resources and time chasing empty trails. Alejandro also began cultivating alliances with other, smaller criminal organizations that had been marginalized by the larger cartels, offering them protection and financial backing in exchange for intelligence and loyalty. These new alliances not only served to bolster his defenses against rival cartels but also provided him with critical inside information about their operations. Simultaneously, Alejandro worked to exploit the growing rift between law enforcement agencies in Mexico and the U.S. With the federal government in Mexico facing its own political turmoil and widespread corruption, Alejandro used this to his advantage, knowing that he could manipulate the fractured relationship between Mexican authorities and their American counterparts. He strengthened his ties with corrupt officials, ensuring that his cartel's activities were protected, even as the pressure from U.S. law enforcement increased. The tensions between the two countries, particularly in relation to the drug trade, worked in Alejandro's favor, creating a divide that he could leverage. However, Alejandro knew that even with all his manipulation and maneuvering, there was still one factor that could derail his plans: the Gulf Cartel. The incursions into his territory were becoming more frequent and more aggressive. Alejandro understood that his survival would ultimately depend on neutralizing the Gulf Cartel's challenge. But instead of meeting force with force, Alejandro chose a more insidious method. He began to exploit the weaknesses within the Gulf Cartel's ranks. By cultivating contacts within their organization, Alejandro began to plant seeds of discord. He subtly fueled existing tensions within the Gulf Cartel, especially between the younger, more ambitious members and the older, more established leadership. He stoked their fears and insecurities, knowing that division within their ranks would make them less formidable. At the same time, Alejandro worked to create a false narrative that would make it seem like the Gulf Cartel was preparing to betray some of its allies in the region, further turning them against each other. In a move that would prove critical, Alejandro orchestrated a series of small, but highly effective, operations designed to make it appear as though the Gulf Cartel was struggling with internal corruption and instability. These moves undermined their credibility, weakening their support among the local population and even causing some of their lower-level operatives to defect to the Veracruz Circle. With the Gulf Cartel distracted by infighting and struggling to maintain its grip on the region, Alejandro had managed to avoid a full-scale war. For now, his position remained secure, but he understood that the web of manipulation and power he had created was fragile. In the world of cartels, nothing lasted forever, and Alejandro knew that the next challenge could come from anywhere, or anyone. As Alejandro Serrano navigated the shifting tides of his cartel empire, he came to a crucial realization: maintaining power in the criminal underworld required not only strategy and manipulation but also an ability to understand and adapt to the human element of the game. It wasn't just about business deals, alliances, and enemies, it was about the men and women who populated the streets, the soldiers who did the dirty work, and the allies who had either pledged their loyalty to him or had been coerced into it. The relationships he built were as important as the drugs he trafficked and the money he laundered. In this world, loyalty could be bought, but it could also be broken. Alejandro had always known that power was fragile, but it was in this next chapter of his reign that he came face to face with a truth he had long feared: the loyalty of his closest associates was not as secure as he had believed. The very men who had helped him rise through the ranks were starting to look at him differently. His rise to the top had been swift, almost methodical, but the price of his ascent was that the very people who helped him achieve that power were becoming increasingly restless. His leadership, while effective, had always been marked by a certain detachment. He didn't rule through violence or intimidation; instead, he relied on intelligence, calculated risks, and long-term vision. This approach had won him allies, but as his power grew, so did the potential for resentment. Alejandro's calm demeanor, which had once been his greatest strength, was now starting to create a distance between him and those around him. They respected him, but they no longer trusted him completely. To some, his cool-headedness came across as coldness, his reluctance to display affection or show vulnerability was starting to breed distrust. It was this discontent that Alejandro began to feel most acutely when one of his most trusted lieutenants, Miguel El Sombra Ruiz, began to pull away. Miguel had been with him since the early days, a soldier with an unwavering commitment to Alejandro's cause. Together, they had built the foundations of the Veracruz Circle, and in many ways, Miguel had been the enforcer, the muscle behind Alejandro's calculated strategies. But recently, something had changed. Miguel's behavior had become erratic, and his eyes, once full of loyalty, now seemed clouded with doubt. He began to question Alejandro's decisions, even suggesting that the cartel should adopt more aggressive tactics. Miguel's shift in attitude was subtle at first, but it was a warning sign, one that Alejandro couldn't ignore. The tension between them grew when Miguel began to act independently, making deals with smaller factions without consulting Alejandro. Alejandro, ever the tactician, knew that such behavior could not be allowed to continue. In the world of organized crime, breaking from the chain of command was a cardinal sin. It was not just a challenge to Alejandro's authority, it was a dangerous game that could easily spiral into something much worse. What made this situation even more complicated was that Miguel's actions were not born of ambition or greed but of something more troubling, a sense of betrayal. Miguel felt sidelined. He had always been the muscle, the one who did the dirty work, while Alejandro orchestrated from the shadows. But as Alejandro's empire grew, so did his need for strategic thinkers and diplomats, and Miguel found himself increasingly marginalized. The power he had once held within the cartel had diminished, and with it, his sense of purpose. Miguel's frustration was not necessarily with Alejandro but with the changing nature of their world, a world where loyalty was increasingly tied to results rather than friendship. Alejandro had become more distant, focusing on the bigger picture while Miguel struggled to find his place in the new order. As tensions between them escalated, Alejandro realized that this was more than just a problem with Miguel, it was a reflection of the larger issues within the cartel. The younger generation of cartel members, who had come into the fold in the aftermath of El Lobo's downfall, had no allegiance to the old guard. They didn't care about loyalty or respect for tradition, they cared about power and profit. They wanted a more aggressive cartel, one that would take what it wanted by force, not by careful negotiation and planning. Alejandro had created a powerful organization, but he had also created a monster, a cartel that was growing impatient, restless, and hungry for blood. At first, Alejandro tried to dismiss these concerns. He believed that the new generation's desire for aggression was simply a phase, one that would pass with time. But as the months went by, he saw that the issue wasn't going away. The cartel's leadership was beginning to fracture, with more and more members questioning his vision. It was clear that the very thing that had allowed him to rise to the top, his strategic thinking and cautious approach, was now becoming a liability. In the midst of this brewing storm, Alejandro realized that he needed to make a choice, either adapt to the changing tides and embrace a more violent approach, or risk losing control of everything he had worked for. The idea of abandoning his principles, the very qualities that had defined him as a leader, was something he struggled with. He had always believed that the long game was the only game worth playing, but the reality of his position was that the cartel's survival now depended on a more immediate, visceral show of force. In a move that would have shocked his inner circle, Alejandro called for a meeting of the cartel's leadership. It was time to make his intentions clear, to reassert his dominance and remind everyone why he had risen to power in the first place. The meeting was tense, with silence hanging in the air as Alejandro addressed his followers. He told them that the world was changing, and that the Veracruz Circle needed to change with it. He spoke of loyalty, but also of survival. He acknowledged that the cartel's strength had always been in its ability to adapt to external pressures, and that it was time for the cartel to embrace the tactics of its rivals. The days of subtlety and negotiation were over. If they were to maintain control of their territory, they needed to show their enemies, and each other, that the Veracruz Circle was a force to be reckoned with. The response from his lieutenants was mixed. Some, like Miguel, seemed to approve of the new direction, while others were wary of the shift in tactics. Alejandro's decision to embrace a more aggressive approach was not without its consequences. His once dominant position within the cartel was now being questioned. In trying to appease the younger members, he had alienated some of his most trusted allies, the very people who had helped him build his empire. The sense of unity that had once defined the Veracruz Circle was beginning to splinter. But Alejandro was determined. He understood the dangers of weakness, and he knew that his survival depended on making bold, decisive moves. There was no turning back now. The Veracruz Circle would either evolve or die, and Alejandro was determined to ensure that it would live on. He had built this empire with his mind, but now, he would have to fight to keep it intact with more than just his intellect. As he walked out of the meeting, Alejandro's mind was racing. He had made his decision, but the consequences were far from clear. What would this new approach mean for his future? Could he keep the balance of power within his cartel intact, or would his attempts to modernize it lead to his downfall? The answers would come in time, but one thing was certain: Alejandro's reign was entering a new, dangerous phase. With Alejandro Serrano's decision to shift his cartel's approach towards a more aggressive stance, he had not only steered the Veracruz Circle into a new era, but he had also put himself at a critical crossroads. The fine line between control and chaos now seemed even thinner, and every move he made carried consequences that could shatter his empire or cement his legacy. The transition to a more violent and confrontational approach would not be seamless, and Alejandro knew that even the slightest misstep could send everything he had worked for spiraling into disaster. As expected, the first test of this new direction came swiftly. The Gulf Cartel, which had long eyed Veracruz's territory, had grown emboldened by their recent expansion in the region. They had sensed weakness in the Circle's leadership and had begun making aggressive moves to seize control of key smuggling routes and strategic locations. It was a moment of reckoning for Alejandro. He had spent years playing the long game, building alliances, using subtlety and intelligence to outmaneuver his rivals. Now, with his back against the wall, he had to act decisively and with overwhelming force. Alejandro's response was swift and ruthless. He ordered a coordinated series of attacks across multiple fronts, targeting the Gulf Cartel's operations at their most vulnerable points. The cartel's leadership was caught off guard by the ferocity of the Veracruz Circle's retaliation. For the first time in years, Alejandro was no longer the shadowy figure in the background, he was the storm itself, a force of nature that could not be ignored. His men hit key Gulf Cartel warehouses, decimated their distribution networks, and executed strategic strikes against their leadership. It was a calculated show of strength meant to send a clear message: the Veracruz Circle would not be intimidated. But in the world of cartels, a show of strength often comes at a heavy cost. The bloody skirmishes and escalating violence between the two factions triggered a chain reaction that reverberated through the streets of Veracruz and beyond. The violence spilled over into civilian areas, and innocent lives were caught in the crossfire. The media, always eager for sensational headlines, began to take notice of the growing violence in the region. Law enforcement, both local and federal, could no longer turn a blind eye to the war between the cartels. What had once been a quiet, shadowy empire was now becoming public, and that attracted unwanted attention. As the violence escalated, so did Alejandro's internal conflict. He had always understood that in the criminal world, aggression was a necessary evil. However, he had hoped to avoid a full-scale war, preferring to manipulate events from the shadows rather than engage in open conflict. Now, however, the chaos was spiraling out of control. Every victory over the Gulf Cartel seemed to be followed by a retaliatory strike, and every retaliatory strike invited more law enforcement scrutiny. The Veracruz Circle was no longer just battling rivals, it was fighting a war on multiple fronts. With the increased bloodshed came mounting pressure from within his ranks. As the toll of the conflict grew, Alejandro's lieutenants began to question whether the violence was truly worth the price. His closest allies, like Miguel, who had supported the shift in strategy, were starting to show signs of concern. The loss of life, the risks involved, and the rising instability made some of the leadership begin to wonder if Alejandro's plan was sustainable in the long term. These concerns were not voiced openly at first. Alejandro's authority still loomed large, but whispers began to circulate. The once unified front of the Veracruz Circle was beginning to crack. The more Alejandro pushed forward with his aggressive tactics, the more he realized that the very strategy that had worked so well for him in the past was becoming his undoing. His calculated, cool-headed approach was being replaced by reactive, often emotional decisions. His desire to prove that he could be as ruthless as his rivals had overshadowed his greatest strength, his ability to think several steps ahead, to stay calm in the face of chaos. As the violence escalated, Alejandro's resolve started to waver. He had seen men like him crumble under the weight of their own decisions, driven mad by paranoia and the pressure of leadership. He feared that he was now on that same path. In the midst of this crisis, Alejandro found himself turning inward, questioning his own decisions. The violence that had once seemed like a necessary measure now felt like a poison spreading through his empire. The men who had once followed him without question were beginning to grow restless. Loyalty was no longer a guarantee, it had become something that could be bought and sold, and the younger generation of cartel members was beginning to show signs of disillusionment. They were not as willing to follow Alejandro into an uncertain war as the old guard had been. The turning point came when a trusted lieutenant, Eduardo L. Lince Martinez, was killed in a bloody ambush, the target of a Gulf cartel attack. Eduardo had been one of the few men Alejandro trusted implicitly. His death was a painful reminder of just how dangerous the world Alejandro had created had become. It was also a wake-up call. Eduardo's death, brutal and senseless, made Alejandro realize just how far the Veracruz Circle had fallen from its roots. What had started as a strategic, intelligent organization built on calculated moves and careful negotiations had transformed into a bloodthirsty machine that fed on violence and destruction. Alejandro took the loss hard. He blamed himself for Eduardo's death, and the guilt began to weigh heavily on his conscience. The responsibility of leadership had never seemed so burdensome. He had brought the cartel to the peak of power, but now, it seemed as if it was all coming apart at the seams. In his quest to dominate, he had inadvertently created an environment where loyalty was no longer enough to hold the organization together. His people were dying, and for what? In the aftermath of Eduardo's death, Alejandro made a crucial decision. He knew that the cartel could not continue down the path it was on, not without risking everything he had built. He called for an emergency meeting of his top lieutenants, including those who had been most vocal in their support of the new aggressive tactics. It was time to reassert control, not through force, but through a return to the strategy that had worked so well for him in the past. The violence would stop. The cartel would return to its roots, intelligence, subtlety, and manipulation. The war with the Gulf cartel would end, not in a bloody confrontation, but through negotiation and strategic alliances. But the damage had already been done. The Veracruz Circle had been irrevocably altered by the violence, and Alejandro's leadership had been called into question. Even as he tried to pull back from the brink, there were whispers within his ranks. Some men, like Miguel, saw the shift as a sign of weakness, a betrayal of everything the cartel had fought for. Others feared that Alejandro's new approach was too little, too late. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and it was unclear whether Alejandro could ever regain the trust of his men. In the days that followed, Alejandro spent long hours contemplating his next move. He had always been a master of manipulation, a man who could see the bigger picture. But now, he found himself unsure of how to navigate the future. His reign had entered a new, uncertain phase. The old tactics, the ones that had brought him so much success, no longer seemed as effective. He was no longer the calm, calculating leader he had once been. The pressures of war, loss, and betrayal had changed him, and it was unclear whether he could ever return to the man he once was. The decision to scale back the violence and embrace a more strategic, calculated approach was not without its challenges. Alejandro Serrano had always been a leader who thrived on careful planning and manipulation, but now, as he tried to pull his cartel from the brink of destruction, he found himself battling not just external forces, but the very structure of his organization. The Veracruz Circle, once a finely tuned machine, now seemed like a fractured empire, held together by thin threads of loyalty and fear. Alejandro was no longer the unchallenged mastermind at the top, he was a man on the defensive, trying to rebuild what had begun to fall apart. The immediate aftermath of Eduardo's death had left a trail of chaos in its wake. The cartel's operations had been disrupted, and many of his trusted lieutenants were questioning the direction in which Alejandro was taking them. The once unified front of the Veracruz Circle was now divided. Some of his men, especially the younger members, had embraced the new, more violent tactics and were reluctant to scale back. They saw the aggressive moves as necessary for survival in an increasingly cutthroat world. To them, the calm, calculating leadership that had brought Alejandro to power now seemed outdated and weak. They were hungry for power, and their loyalty was starting to waver. On the other hand, the older, more seasoned members of the cartel, those who had been with Alejandro since the early days, began to grow frustrated. They had been the ones who had helped him build the Veracruz Circle into the empire it had become. They had followed his vision of a cartel built on intelligence, negotiation, and careful strategy. Now, with the sudden shift toward violence, they felt alienated and concerned that the foundation of the organization was being dismantled. These men, loyal to a fault, were beginning to question whether Alejandro still had the vision and the ability to lead them through this new era. The tension within the cartel was palpable. In private meetings with his closest advisors, Alejandro began to see the cracks that had formed in the foundation of his empire. The whispers of discontent were growing louder. Some of his lieutenants, like Miguel and Eduardo before him, were questioning his decisions. They didn't understand why Alejandro, a man who had built his empire on patience and subtlety, was now abandoning those principles for a more reckless and immediate form of violence. The very essence of what had made the Veracruz Circle different from the other cartels was slipping away. Alejandro was a man who thrived in moments of solitude, but even he could not escape the weight of his decisions. He was no longer just worried about the survival of his cartel, he was worried about his own survival within it. His inner circle, once a group of loyal and trusted men, was starting to fracture. The fear that had once kept his enemies at bay was now infecting his own ranks. Loyalty, the cornerstone of any cartel, was no longer a guarantee. In a world where men had been bought and sold for far less, Alejandro found himself wondering how much his word still meant. The problem wasn't just about the immediate violence, it was about the longer-term consequences of his decisions. The Gulf Cartel, the Zetas, and other rivals had been watching closely, and they could sense the vulnerability in the Veracruz Circle. When Alejandro had been able to manipulate from the shadows, he had been untouchable. But now that the circle had become embroiled in direct warfare, it had opened the door for rival factions to move in. Alejandro's rivals were patient and knew that in the world of organized crime, power could be seized at the right moment, when the leader was distracted or weak. Alejandro realized that the cartel needed to find a way to regain its strength, not just through violence, but through diplomacy and strategic alliances. The constant warfare was draining resources, weakening their operations, and putting everyone at risk. He had no choice but to make some hard decisions. One of those decisions was to re-engage with some of the old contacts and allies who had helped him in the past. These were powerful figures from the world of politics, law enforcement, and business who had turned a blind eye to the cartel's operations in exchange for favors and protection. Alejandro had always maintained a delicate balance of alliances, knowing that loyalty in the criminal underworld was often as fickle as the tides. But now, with the cartel's future uncertain, it was time to call in those favors. The first of these old allies to respond was Arturo El Sabio Vega, a former politician who had once been a key player in the cartel's efforts to influence the political landscape of Veracruz. El Sabio had connections that reached deep into the state's government, and his network had provided invaluable protection for the cartel in the past. Alejandro knew that the cartel's survival would depend on whether he could restore these alliances and re-establish his influence over the political structure. El Sabio, however, was not easily swayed. He had seen the toll the cartel's violent tactics had taken, not just on the streets, but on the delicate system of favors that had kept them all in power. Violence is a necessary evil, Alejandro, El Sabio told him over a private meeting in a dimly lit room. But it's not the only way to power. You've forgotten that. And now, you're losing the one thing that mattered most, control. El Sabio's words were a wake-up call for Alejandro. It was true. He had let the violence consume him. He had let the need for dominance cloud his judgment, forgetting that control was not just about force, but about influence, about staying one step ahead of everyone else without resorting to bloodshed. In that moment, Alejandro realized he had been playing the wrong game. He had become so focused on outmuscling his enemies that he had lost sight of the bigger picture. But the damage had already been done. The power struggles within his cartel were intensifying, and even as Alejandro sought to re-establish his influence over the political realm, the cracks within his organization were widening. The younger members of the Veracruz Circle, emboldened by the recent violence, began to question the old alliances that had helped build the cartel. They were eager for more power, more territory, and they were less interested in the slow, steady climb that had once been Alejandro's hallmark. As Alejandro faced the increasingly complex web of alliances, rivalries, and power struggles, he found himself questioning everything that had brought him to this point. His empire, once a model of calculated growth and strategic maneuvering, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. The question that haunted him was no longer just about how to defeat his rivals. It was about how to salvage his legacy, and whether he could ever reclaim the power and control that had once been his without losing everything in the process. Each decision he made now carried the weight of his past, his choices, his mistakes, and the countless lives that had been altered in his wake. Alejandro Serrano was no longer just a cartel leader, he was a man at war with himself, caught between the person he had once been and the leader he had become. And with every passing day, the future of the Veracruz Circle grew more uncertain. The aftermath of the turmoil Alejandro had instigated seemed to stretch on without end. The damage to the Veracruz Circle was evident, not only in the form of lost lives but also in the ripple effect it had caused within the underworld's complex web of alliances. What had once been a seamless operation, built on strategic thought and calculated action, was now a fractured empire held together by mere threads. Alejandro had made his decision to dial back the violence, but the consequences of his earlier choices were impossible to erase. Even as he tried to shift the organization back to its roots, the cartel was still reeling from the intensity of the conflict. The Gulf Cartel, though temporarily stunned, had begun to recover from the initial shock of the Veracruz Circle's retaliatory strikes. They had regrouped, reorganized, and launched a series of smaller, covert attacks aimed at destabilizing the Circle's operations. With the law enforcement pressure mounting and the constant tension from their rivals, Alejandro found himself forced to reassess his approach. In the days that followed, the scale of the political consequences became clear. Alejandro had always relied on a mix of high-level connections to ensure the Veracruz Circle's operations could continue relatively undisturbed. But now, those relationships were under threat. The escalation of violence had caught the attention of local politicians, law enforcement agencies, and even higher-level government figures, all of whom were now facing increasing pressure from their constituencies to take action. The once carefully curated network of corruption and influence began to fray, as those who had previously been loyal to the Circle sought to distance themselves from the chaos that now surrounded them. The stress of managing the political fallout was taking a toll on Alejandro's mental state. He had always prided himself on being calm and composed, a man who could think several steps ahead of his rivals and keep the chaos at bay. But now, in the face of a collapsing empire, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. The weight of leadership had always been heavy, but now it felt unbearable. His trusted lieutenants, those who had once admired him for his tactical brilliance, were beginning to doubt his ability to lead them out of this mess. His decisions were no longer universally accepted, even his most loyal allies questioned his judgment. The situation had reached a critical point. Alejandro was at a crossroads, a place where his past successes seemed to hold no power over the present challenges he faced. The old guard, the men who had helped build the Veracruz Circle into the powerhouse it had once been, were losing faith in him. Many of them, like Miguel, had supported the more aggressive strategy, but they had also believed in Alejandro's vision for long-term stability. Now, they were questioning whether that vision still existed, or if Alejandro was simply a man lost in the chaos of his own making. Miguel, ever the pragmatic strategist, pulled Alejandro aside one evening. They met in a dimly lit back room of a nondescript restaurant, a place where they could speak freely without the risk of being overheard. "Alejandro," Miguel said quietly, "we've been through a lot together. But I need to know, what's your plan now? The old ways are slipping away, and I'm not sure you can fix this just by sitting back and waiting for things to settle. We need a clear direction, or the circle will collapse." Alejandro, typically a man of few words, was silent for a long time. He understood the gravity of Miguel's words. The question was no longer just about how to survive the war with the Gulf Cartel or how to maintain control over Veracruz's smuggling routes. It was about the survival of the circle itself. Would it endure, or would it be reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the bloody history of Mexico's cartels? The conversation lingered in Alejandro's mind long after it had ended. He had always been a man of action, one who could weigh the risks and make decisions swiftly. But now, with the stakes higher than ever before, his mind raced through the possible outcomes of every choice. His choices, however, were no longer as simple as they once were. Every decision now carried consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate future. And, more troubling still, Alejandro found himself increasingly isolated. His allies were becoming fewer, his enemies multiplying. Even the city of Veracruz itself, once his kingdom, now felt like an alien place, a city of shadows, constantly shifting under the weight of betrayal. To make matters worse, the violence that had once been contained to the streets was now spilling over into the homes and businesses of the city's citizens. Innocent lives were lost in the crossfire, and the media, which had previously been either silent or complicit in covering up the circle's operations, now began to highlight the atrocities. What had once been a quiet, invisible war between cartels was becoming an open spectacle, something that even the politicians who had been on Alejandro's payroll could no longer ignore. The government was feeling the heat, and Alejandro could sense that it was only a matter of time before the full force of the state would come down on him. Alejandro needed to act fast. He understood that in the underworld, survival meant adaptation. The old ways of doing business, quiet, subtle, and calculated, were no longer sufficient. In the face of escalating violence and political pressure, Alejandro knew he needed to restore the illusion of control, to remind both his allies and his enemies that he was still a force to be reckoned with. It was time to return to the shadows, to pull the strings from behind the scenes once more, even if it meant a complete overhaul of the organization. The first step was to reclaim his control over Veracruz. He needed to remind the people of the city who had ruled it for so long. He organized a show of force, an event that would demonstrate the circle's resilience and remind the other cartels that they could not take what was rightfully theirs. The operation was executed with precision. Key members of the Gulf Cartel were targeted in a series of coordinated attacks, and the body count was high. This brutal display of power, though controversial within the circle itself, was meant to send a message. But as Alejandro watched the aftermath of the operation unfold, he realized that the message was not one of strength, it was a cry for survival. The old man who had once ruled the cartel with quiet authority was now a leader fighting to maintain his place in the world he had built. The shadows that had once been his domain were now closing in on him, and he could not be sure whether the circle would remain under his control or slip away from him altogether. The stakes had never been higher. Alejandro was at a tipping point, standing on the edge of everything he had built. The direction he chose now would determine whether he would regain control of the Veracruz Circle or see it collapse entirely. Every move, every word, every alliance, and every betrayal would play a part in the outcome. But as he pondered his next step, Alejandro realized that the greatest challenge of all would be learning to balance the empire he had created with the cost of its survival. Despite the show of strength that Alejandro had orchestrated, the tension within the Veracruz Circle continued to simmer. His display of power had momentarily silenced his critics, but it had also deepened the cracks within his organization. In the underworld, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed, and even as Alejandro fought to maintain his control, the true costs of his decisions began to reveal themselves. His lieutenants, once loyal to the very core, were now questioning their place within the cartel. The younger members, hungry for more power, began to feel disillusioned with the slow, methodical approach that had once characterized the circle's rise. Alejandro's ability to unite them under a single vision was weakening, and it became increasingly clear that his leadership was no longer the unshakable force it once had been. Miguel, still one of Alejandro's most trusted lieutenants, was growing increasingly concerned. The once united front of the cartel had fractured, and Miguel was finding himself at odds with some of the younger, more aggressive members of the organization. They questioned his authority, and in turn, Miguel began to question Alejandro's. It wasn't just the violence that had caused this rift, it was the shift in leadership style. Alejandro's calculated, quiet methods had always been the foundation of their success. But now, in the face of mounting pressure, it seemed as though the very man who had brought the Veracruz Circle to its peak was losing his touch. Miguel, ever pragmatic, couldn't help but wonder if they had reached a point of no return. The Gulf Cartel, ever watchful of their rivals, had taken advantage of the chaos. Their operations, which had been temporarily stifled by Alejandro's previous strikes, were now back in full force. They had learned from their earlier missteps and had begun to target Alejandro's allies within the political landscape. The violence in Veracruz had brought unwanted attention from both the media and law enforcement, and the politicians who had once turned a blind eye were now scrambling to cover their tracks. It wasn't just the cartel's operations that were under threat, it was the entire infrastructure that had supported them. Alejandro had always known that his influence in politics was a precarious thing, but now it felt as though that power was slipping from his grasp. The very politicians who had helped him navigate the shifting tides of the criminal world were now looking for ways to distance themselves from the growing scandal. In the face of this mounting pressure, Alejandro knew that he had to act swiftly. The older members of the cartel, those who had been with him from the beginning, had begun to openly question his ability to lead. Even though they were loyal to him, their loyalty was being tested by the visible signs of weakness in the organization. As the fractures within the cartel deepened, Alejandro began to understand that the time for subtlety had passed. His efforts to regain control over Veracruz were now a matter of survival, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been loyal to him. The Gulf Cartel's aggression was becoming more sophisticated, and the political landscape in Veracruz was becoming increasingly hostile. Alejandro needed a plan, and he needed it fast. It was during this period of uncertainty that Alejandro decided to take the boldest step of his leadership yet. He reached out to a man from his past, a figure who had once been a vital ally but had since become a shadowy figure in the world of organized crime. This man, known only as El Lobo, had once been a key player in the cartel's early expansion. His connections ran deep within the world of law enforcement and military circles. El Lobo had left the cartel years ago after a falling out with Alejandro, but Alejandro knew that he could no longer afford to let old grudges stand in the way of securing his future. The meeting was set in a secluded villa on the outskirts of Veracruz, away from the prying eyes of both law enforcement and cartel rivals. Alejandro arrived early, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had no illusions about what this meeting might entail. El Lobo was a dangerous man, unpredictable and ruthless, but Alejandro understood that his expertise could tip the scales in their favor. The two men had a complicated history, but Alejandro was willing to swallow his pride if it meant saving the Veracruz Circle. When El Lobo arrived, the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. The last time they had spoken, they had been on opposite sides of a violent feud, a feud that had left both of them with scars, physical and emotional. But as they sat across from each other, Alejandro could feel the weight of the years between them. The conversation began with cautious pleasantries, but it didn't take long before the gravity of the situation became clear. "Why come to me, Alejandro?" El Lobo asked, his voice low and measured. "You know as well as I do that I left the circle for a reason. I've got my own operations now. Why risk it all for a cartel that's falling apart?" Alejandro, ever the strategist, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Because I need you," he said simply. "I've lost control of the circle. The Gulf Cartel is pushing back harder than ever, and my own people are questioning my leadership. I need your connections, your influence. Without it, everything we've built is gone." El Lobo studied him carefully, his eyes narrowing. "You think I'll just walk back into this mess for you? After everything that happened?" Alejandro's expression hardened. "I don't expect you to do it for me. I expect you to do it for yourself. You're not the man you were before. You've got more power now than you ever had with the circle. But you know the game. You know the politics. And you know how to win." There was a long pause before El Lobo leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table. "What's your plan?" he asked, his voice now tinged with curiosity. Alejandro laid out his strategy. He would re-establish connections with key allies, both within the government and the criminal world. He would use his influence to broker deals with smaller cartels, aligning them with the Veracruz Circle to create a more formidable force against the Gulf Cartel. But he needed El Lobo's network to make it happen. Without the right intelligence, the right connections in law enforcement, Alejandro's plans would fail before they even began. El Lobo remained silent for a moment, considering the offer. Finally, he nodded. "All right. I'll help. But remember, Alejandro, I'm not your pawn. This is a partnership. If you want to survive, you'll have to play by my rules." Alejandro knew that this was the turning point. The fate of the Veracruz Circle now rested in their hands. Whether they could reclaim their former glory or fade into obscurity would depend on the success of this fragile alliance. For the first time in a long time, Alejandro felt a spark of hope. The path ahead would not be easy, and the cost of survival would be high, but it was the only option left. In the weeks following his meeting with El Lobo, Alejandro focused all his energy on repairing the fractured relationships within the Veracruz Circle and rebuilding the empire that had once been invincible. El Lobo, ever the tactician, proved to be invaluable. With his vast network of allies in the world of law enforcement and his deep connections in military circles, he provided Alejandro with the leverage he so desperately needed. Together, they began to implement a series of covert operations designed to strengthen the circle's position and undermine their rivals. El Lobo's first move was to make contact with several smaller cartels operating in the region, ones that had been on the fringe of the circle's influence but were now vulnerable due to the Gulf Cartel's increasing dominance. These cartels, though not as powerful as the Circle or the Gulf, had their own networks and resources, and their loyalty could be bought with the right incentives. Alejandro knew that forming alliances with these factions would help shore up his defenses, but he also understood the risks involved. In this world, alliances were fragile, and betrayal was always lurking in the shadows. But for the time being, he had no choice. The first of these smaller cartels to align with the Veracruz Circle was led by a figure known as El Halcón, a ruthless and cunning leader with a reputation for brutality. El Halcón had built his power on the fringes, operating in the underdeveloped areas outside Veracruz, and he had always kept a low profile to avoid attracting the attention of the larger cartels. But when El Lobo approached him with an offer of protection and resources, El Halcón saw an opportunity to expand his influence. He agreed to join forces with the Veracruz Circle, offering his men and his territory in exchange for a stake in the Circle's lucrative smuggling operations. The alliance, while beneficial, was far from simple. El Halcón was no fool. He had his own ambitions and didn't intend to be a subordinate to Alejandro for long. Alejandro knew this, and it was precisely why he kept El Halcón on a tight leash. The arrangement was clear: for now, El Halcón would lend his support, but Alejandro would retain control of the key smuggling routes and the most valuable territories. It was a temporary partnership, one that could easily dissolve if the power dynamics shifted in the wrong direction. In the meantime, Alejandro's focus also turned to his relationship with the political elites who had once been his closest allies. He knew that the recent violence, along with the media's growing scrutiny, had strained these relationships to the breaking point. Several key politicians had already begun distancing themselves from him, no longer willing to tolerate the increasing heat from law enforcement and public outrage. Some had even begun to work behind his back, forging alliances with rival cartels and promising to bring down the Veracruz Circle in exchange for their own protection. Alejandro's first move was to reach out to the few remaining loyal politicians and offer them incentives that would keep them aligned with the Circle. He began making quiet visits to the homes and offices of these politicians, presenting them with new, more lucrative deals. He promised them protection, influence, and, of course, money, lots of it. But Alejandro was keenly aware of the fact that he was running out of time. The longer he allowed the Gulf Cartel and the government to make headway against his operations, the more likely it became that his empire would crumble. One of the key figures he needed to secure was the governor of Veracruz, a man named José Luis Cortés. Cortés had always been a steadfast ally of the Circle, using his political position to shield the cartel from law enforcement and rival gangs. But with public opinion turning against him, Cortés found himself in a precarious position. Alejandro knew that he needed to remind Cortés just how much he stood to lose if he turned against the Circle. The threat was not a direct one. Alejandro had learned long ago that subtlety was far more effective than violence when it came to dealing with politicians. But the message was clear: Cortés could either continue to enjoy the benefits of his association with the Circle or risk losing everything. To sweeten the deal, Alejandro offered Cortés a substantial financial windfall, enough to ensure his political future for years to come. He also offered him a degree of control over the distribution of narcotics in certain regions of Veracruz, an offer that would allow the governor to pocket even more money without appearing to be directly involved in the cartel's operations. Cortés hesitated at first, but the lure of wealth and power was too great to resist. In the end, he agreed to stay loyal to the Circle. But as Alejandro strengthened his alliances with smaller cartels and political figures, the threat from the Gulf Cartel loomed larger than ever. The Gulf Cartel, having recovered from their initial setbacks, was now operating with renewed intensity. They had not only rebuilt their forces but had also solidified their grip on key routes along the border. It wasn't just the territory in Veracruz that was at risk, it was Alejandro's entire network, which spanned much of Mexico's southern region. The Gulf Cartel's leaders, including the notorious Ojael Cardenas, had been quietly building alliances of their own, consolidating power within the cartel and preparing for a major offensive. Alejandro knew that he needed to act swiftly to prevent the Gulf Cartel from taking over the entire region. He called a meeting with his closest advisors, including Miguel and El Lobo, to discuss their next move. The conversation was tense, with each man presenting different strategies for dealing with the Gulf Cartel's threat. Some suggested that they should launch a direct assault on the Gulf Cartel's strongholds, while others argued that a more measured approach, focusing on political manipulation and undermining their rivals' alliances, was the best way forward. In the end, Alejandro decided on a two-pronged approach. He would continue to build his alliances with smaller cartels and political figures, using his influence to tighten the grip around the Gulf Cartel's operations. At the same time, he would focus on building a network of informants within the Gulf Cartel itself, using the knowledge they provided to strike at the heart of the cartel's infrastructure. The plan was risky, and it would require precision and secrecy, but Alejandro was no stranger to danger. He knew that if he didn't act decisively, the Gulf Cartel would soon become an unstoppable force in the region. As the weeks passed, the tension between the Veracruz Circle and the Gulf Cartel continued to rise. Both sides prepared for what seemed to be an inevitable conflict. Alejandro's actions were carefully calculated, but even he could not predict how the events would unfold. The underworld was a chaotic place, where loyalty was fleeting and the balance of power could shift in the blink of an eye. Alejandro was caught in the middle of this storm, trying to hold on to what he had built while preparing for a war that would determine the future of the Veracruz Circle. The storm Alejandro had anticipated was quickly approaching. While the Veracruz Circle had slowly begun to regain its foothold through careful alliances and subtle maneuvers, the Gulf Cartel, under Ojael Cardenas, was now fully mobilized and intent on wiping out its competitors. The Gulf Cartel's reach had expanded dramatically, and with their entrenched power in key regions, they were increasingly encroaching on territories once controlled by the Veracruz Circle. Every move Alejandro made seemed to be met with a swift, retaliatory strike. The cartel wars that had once been the undercurrent of his rise to power were now escalating into full-scale conflict, and the stakes had never been higher. It was no longer just about controlling drug routes or smuggling corridors, it was about survival. Alejandro, ever the strategist, knew he had no choice but to fight back, and he did so with precision. He called together his inner circle, Miguel, El Lobo, and his most trusted lieutenants. The room was tense, each member of the Veracruz Circle well aware of the impending war. Miguel, who had been Alejandro's confidant from the beginning, was growing more nervous as the stakes rose higher. The methods Alejandro had used to keep the circle intact had worked for a time, but now the violence was spilling over, and the toll was becoming apparent. Ojael is ready to bring the war to us, Alejandro, Miguel warned, his voice low but firm. He won't stop until he's crushed us. We can't keep hiding behind political connections forever. Alejandro's eyes narrowed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind, ever calculating, was already thinking several steps ahead. We won't hide. We fight on our terms. We'll use everything we have to make them regret coming after us, he replied coldly. El Lobo, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke. We need to hit them where it hurts. Not just on the streets, but in their pockets. If we target their key smuggling routes, we can force them to stretch their resources thin. The more they have to fight on multiple fronts, the easier it will be for us to take them down. Alejandro considered this. El Lobo was a master of strategy, and his insights had always proven invaluable. The Gulf Cartel was large, but its structure was vulnerable in certain places. Alejandro had learned long ago that the key to defeating a stronger opponent was to expose their weaknesses and exploit them. The Gulf Cartel's Achilles heel lay in its reliance on key ports and border crossings for smuggling drugs and weapons. By targeting these vital routes, Alejandro could begin to destabilize the Gulf Cartel's operations. Over the next few weeks, Alejandro implemented a carefully crafted series of attacks designed to cripple the Gulf Cartel's logistics. His men, loyal but now hardened by years of warfare, infiltrated key points along the southern border, taking out critical transport networks. He also enlisted the help of smaller cartels, leveraging their knowledge of the Gulf's inner workings to infiltrate and disrupt the larger organization. But despite his careful planning, Alejandro could feel the pressure building from every side. The Gulf Cartel's response was swift and brutal. In the dead of night, one of Alejandro's allies was ambushed, their convoy of supplies completely wiped out. It was a message: the Gulf Cartel would not be intimidated. But Alejandro, ever the tactician, did not flinch. Instead, he ramped up his own efforts, increasing the scale of his attacks. But with each passing day, the cost of this war began to take its toll. The violence escalated, the casualties mounted, and the political landscape began to shift further away from the Veracruz Circle. As the situation grew direr, Alejandro turned his attention to his political allies once again. It was clear that the government could no longer turn a blind eye to the escalating violence. Law enforcement, emboldened by the public outcry, had begun to make more aggressive moves against the cartel. The connections Alejandro had once relied upon were now under heavy scrutiny. Even the governor, José Luis Cortés, who had been a pillar of support, seemed to be wavering. In private meetings, Cortés was no longer as confident as he had once been. The pressure to distance himself from Alejandro was mounting, and Alejandro could sense it. He knew that without the governor's support, his entire network would begin to unravel. In the midst of this political chaos, Alejandro was forced to make a decision. He needed to either reassert control over the government and secure his alliances or risk losing everything. The situation was delicate. If he pressed too hard, it might push Cortés into the arms of the Gulf Cartel. But if he didn't act soon, the circle would lose its last connection to the political power that had protected them for so long. Alejandro reached out to José Luis Cortés, requesting a private meeting. This time, the meeting took place not in the familiar halls of power, but in a quiet, unmarked building on the outskirts of Veracruz, a neutral ground where both men could speak freely, away from the prying eyes of law enforcement and rival cartel factions. As they sat across from each other, the tension in the room was palpable. "You've been quiet lately, José Luis," Alejandro began, his voice calm but firm. "I know you've been under pressure. But let's not forget who made you governor in the first place." Cortés shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze avoiding Alejandro's. "The situation has changed, Alejandro. I don't have the same influence I once did. The public is turning against us, and law enforcement is breathing down my neck. I can't keep supporting you if this violence continues." Alejandro leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I understand the situation, José Luis. But I'm not asking for blind loyalty. I'm offering a way out, a way for you to stay in power and continue to enjoy the benefits of our partnership. But that requires action. If you turn your back on me now, everything you've built will crumble." The governor's face remained unreadable. For a moment, there was only silence between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. Finally, Cortés spoke, his voice quieter now. "What do you want me to do?" Alejandro's lips curled into a slight, calculating smile. "I want you to remind the people of Veracruz who holds the power in this state. I want you to reinstate our connections with law enforcement, even if it means going against the tide of public opinion. I need you to show them that the Veracruz Circle is not a force to be reckoned with." It was a risky move, but Alejandro knew it was the only way to salvage his empire. The battle for Veracruz had become more than just a fight for territory, it had become a battle for survival. The Gulf Cartel was pushing them to the edge, and Alejandro had to act decisively to stay in control. The political web he had carefully woven over the years was beginning to unravel, but he wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. As he left the meeting with Cortés, Alejandro knew that the next phase of the war would be even more dangerous than the last. The stakes had been raised. The Gulf Cartel was coming for him, and he was prepared to fight back, using every resource at his disposal. The question now was whether his allies, political, criminal, or otherwise, would continue to stand by him or if the cracks in his empire would finally split wide open. As the war with the Gulf Cartel escalated, Alejandro found himself at the center of a storm that seemed impossible to control. The attacks on his network grew more frequent, more violent, and more brazen. The once secure territories of the Veracruz Circle were being torn apart, and the resources Alejandro had spent years building were now under constant threat. His empire, which had once felt like an indomitable fortress, was slowly crumbling under the weight of external attacks and internal betrayals. Alejandro knew that survival now required more than just military might. The violence had reached such a pitch that even the most loyal of his allies were beginning to question whether it was worth the cost. The once solid foundations of his cartel were shaking, and Alejandro, despite his experience and ruthlessness, could feel the ground beneath him slipping. It was in the midst of this chaos that a new threat emerged, a series of leaks within his own organization. His most trusted lieutenants, the ones he had relied on for years, had begun to turn on him, selling information to rival cartels and, more dangerously, to the authorities. Alejandro knew the stakes had reached a new level of peril. If the Gulf Cartel was able to exploit these leaks, his empire would fall in a matter of weeks. The first signs of betrayal came subtly. A small shipment of drugs, meant for distribution through the northern routes, had been intercepted by federal authorities. At first, Alejandro thought it was just a routine bust, a common tactic by law enforcement to show progress and make headlines. But as the days passed, more shipments began to disappear, and he began to notice patterns in the raids. His men were being targeted with surgical precision, as if someone on the inside had tipped off the authorities about each movement. It was impossible to ignore the possibility that someone close to him had betrayed him. Alejandro took immediate action, calling together his inner circle for an emergency meeting. Miguel and El Lobo were already there, their faces grim as they waited for Alejandro to speak. "What the hell is happening?" Alejandro's voice was cold, measured, but there was a sharpness to it that indicated just how serious he was. He had never been a man to display weakness, but this situation had him on edge. The silence in the room was heavy, each of his men aware that they were on the cusp of something terrible. Miguel spoke first, his voice low. "It could be one of our own. The leaks, the raids, they're too coordinated. It's not random. Someone's giving them information." Alejandro's gaze locked onto Miguel. "Who?" "We don't know yet," Miguel replied. "But we'll find out. I'll start by questioning the men closest to you, anyone with direct access to our operations." Alejandro nodded, his mind already racing. The idea that one of his own had betrayed him was a bitter pill to swallow. He had always believed in loyalty, and the thought that someone within his ranks could turn against him felt like a personal affront. But business was business, and Alejandro knew he couldn't afford to let sentimentality cloud his judgment. He needed to act quickly to prevent further damage. The next few days were a blur of tension and suspicion. Alejandro had his men interrogate several of his lieutenants, but each response was more or less the same: denial and confusion. No one knew anything, or at least, they claimed they didn't. But Alejandro wasn't convinced. The raids continued, and the Gulf Cartel seemed to be one step ahead at every turn. His grip on the situation was slipping, and he needed answers. It wasn't until he had a quiet conversation with El Lobo that things began to take shape. El Lobo, ever the astute observer, had been quietly watching the patterns of behavior within the circle, paying attention to every movement, every exchange of information. "There's something off," El Lobo said one evening as they sat together in a dimly lit room. "I've been watching the men who are closest to you, Alejandro. I think it's one of the newer recruits. Someone who's been brought in within the last year. It could be one of the ones who's been trying to move up the ranks too quickly." Alejandro leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "What makes you think that?" El Lobo's gaze shifted toward the door, as though checking for anyone who might be listening. "These men, they're ambitious. Too ambitious. And in this world, ambition is dangerous. It blinds people. It makes them think they can control the game, even when they don't understand the rules." The realization hit Alejandro like a ton of bricks. His organization was being undermined from within, not by those who had been with him from the beginning, but by newcomers eager to rise to power. Their ambition had clouded their judgment, and in their desperation to climb the ranks, they had made dangerous deals with the Gulf Cartel, or perhaps even law enforcement, in exchange for favors. The more Alejandro thought about it, the more it made sense. The newcomers were the ones who had the least to lose and the most to gain by selling information. Alejandro made the decision to act swiftly. He knew he couldn't afford to wait any longer. He needed to purge the circle of these traitors before they brought everything crashing down. He gave El Lobo the order to handle the situation discreetly, to weed out the traitors without causing too much of a stir. El Lobo's method was always efficient, cold, and without mercy. He was the right man for the job. But just as the operation to root out the traitors began, Alejandro was struck with a far more pressing concern. The Gulf Cartel, sensing vulnerability, had made a bold move. They had launched a direct assault on one of the Veracruz Circle's strongest territories, a crucial smuggling route that ran through the heart of Veracruz. This wasn't just a small skirmish, it was a full-on attack, aimed at crippling Alejandro's ability to move his goods across the region. The timing couldn't have been worse. Alejandro had to divide his attention between dealing with the traitors within his own ranks and protecting the vital infrastructure of his empire. The Gulf Cartel, under Ojael Cardenas, was relentless. They had seen the cracks in the Veracruz Circle's armor, and they were going for the kill. Alejandro knew that if he didn't act fast, the circle would be torn apart, and his empire would be no more than a memory. The battle for control of the Veracruz smuggling routes was brutal. Alejandro's men fought fiercely to hold their ground, but the Gulf Cartel had the numbers, and they were better equipped. Every day, the pressure mounted. Alejandro knew that a decisive victory was needed, or else he would lose everything he had worked for. But as the war intensified, he realized that the battle for Veracruz was not just about territory, it was a fight for his survival, his legacy. And in this world, survival was never guaranteed. As Alejandro prepared for what could be the final confrontation with the Gulf Cartel, he steeled himself for the inevitable fallout. This was the moment that would define the future of the Veracruz Circle, and the cost of failure was unimaginable. The days following the attack on the Veracruz smuggling routes were a blur of chaos, and Alejandro's life seemed to hang in the balance. His men, battle-worn and exhausted, were trying to regroup after the initial shock of the Gulf Cartel's assault. It had been a costly battle, and while they had managed to stave off the cartel's forces for now, Alejandro knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger war. The Gulf Cartel was ruthless, and Ojael Cardenas was not a man who would back down easily. Alejandro's mind raced as he tried to plan the next move. This wasn't just about fighting over territory anymore, it was a test of endurance, a brutal game of survival. The Veracruz Circle had been built on alliances, secrecy, and trust, but now, those very pillars were crumbling. With the constant pressure from the Gulf Cartel, internal betrayals, and the creeping influence of law enforcement, Alejandro found himself cornered in a way he had never experienced before. The weight of leadership, the lives of his men, and the future of the organization all depended on his next steps. But Alejandro was a master tactician, and he refused to give in to fear or despair. His strategic mind never rested, and he began to formulate a new plan, one that would not only protect his empire but possibly extend its influence beyond Veracruz. He knew that the cartel's strength lay in its ability to control key regions and maintain a grip on trade routes. To counter this, Alejandro would need to strike back at the cartel's heart, their supply chain, their leadership, and their power. The first part of his strategy involved reinforcing the circle's existing strongholds, particularly the smuggling routes that connected Veracruz to the rest of Mexico. Alejandro ordered his men to fortify these routes with new security measures, creating layers of protection against the Gulf Cartel's incursions. The aim was to slow them down, make them bleed resources, and force them into a prolonged fight. Alejandro knew that a drawn-out conflict would ultimately wear down the cartel's resolve, but he also understood that his own forces were stretched thin. They couldn't afford to defend every inch of territory. The second part of Alejandro's plan was far more covert. He would target the Gulf Cartel's leadership directly. Ojael Cardenas, the leader of the Gulf Cartel, had been a thorn in his side for years, but Alejandro understood the delicate balance of power between rival cartels. Ojael was dangerous, but he was also vulnerable. If Alejandro could undermine his leadership, either through subterfuge or a direct hit, it would send shockwaves through the cartel and give the Veracruz Circle the opportunity to strike a decisive blow. To carry out this portion of the plan, Alejandro reached out to his most trusted ally, El Lobo. El Lobo was known for his ruthlessness, but also for his cunning. He was the perfect man for the job. Alejandro knew that getting close to Ojael would not be easy. The Gulf Cartel's leader was always surrounded by a tight circle of bodyguards and loyalists. But Alejandro had a few assets in place, some men on the inside of the Gulf Cartel who could be leveraged to gain valuable intelligence. The plan was simple: infiltrate the cartel's inner circle, plant misinformation, and destabilize Ojael's position. This would create doubt among his closest allies, turning them against him. With enough confusion sown, Alejandro could strike at a moment of weakness. But there was a risk. If the Gulf Cartel realized what was happening too soon, they would retaliate with brutal force. Alejandro's own men could be caught in the crossfire. As the preparations for this mission unfolded, Alejandro continued to deal with the fallout from the earlier attack. His men were weary, some beginning to question whether it was worth continuing the fight. In his quieter moments, Alejandro couldn't help but reflect on the toll the war had taken on him personally. He had built this empire from nothing, using his intelligence, patience, and cunning. But now, faced with overwhelming odds, he wondered how long he could keep up the fight. Every decision seemed to have consequences, every victory came with a cost. Yet, the thought of surrender was not an option. Alejandro had never been one to back down from a challenge. His legacy, his family, and his place in the criminal world depended on his ability to adapt and survive. This was not just a battle for control, it was a battle for his very identity. The Veracruz Circle, for all its faults and internal struggles, had been his creation. To lose it would mean losing everything he had worked for, everything he had become. As the days wore on, Alejandro grew increasingly impatient. The Gulf Cartel was not sitting idly by. They had launched several more attacks on his territories, and Alejandro knew they were preparing for another major assault. It was clear they were hoping to overwhelm the Veracruz Circle once and for all. But Alejandro had anticipated this, and his network of informants was constantly feeding him information about the cartel's movements. In a rare moment of calm, Alejandro met with his closest confidants, Miguel, El Lobo, and a few trusted lieutenants. They sat in a secluded mansion, far from the chaos of the front lines, strategizing. Alejandro leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he addressed the group. "It's time to strike. We've been playing defense long enough. We know where they're going to hit next," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "We'll give them a taste of their own medicine. We'll hit them hard, at the heart of their operations. But we'll do it in a way that leaves them questioning everything." The plan was set into motion within hours. Alejandro's men were ready for the operation, and El Lobo led the charge. The aim was to sabotage key supply routes, hit cartel strongholds, and cripple their ability to continue their attacks on Veracruz. But more importantly, it was about sending a message to Ojael Cardenas, that the Veracruz Circle was not finished, and that Alejandro was still a force to be reckoned with. As the operation unfolded, Alejandro felt a strange calm wash over him. The adrenaline of battle was nothing new, but there was something different about this moment. It was as if everything in his life had led to this point, the culmination of years of planning, betrayal, and bloodshed. This was the defining moment, the one that would determine whether he would continue to rise or fall into obscurity. The war with the Gulf Cartel had reached a new level, and Alejandro had no intention of losing. In the hours that followed, the Veracruz Circle launched a series of swift and brutal attacks on the Gulf Cartel's most vulnerable positions. The cartel, taken by surprise, struggled to mount an effective response. Alejandro's forces hit fast and hard, using the element of surprise to their advantage. By the time the Gulf Cartel realized what was happening, it was already too late. Their supply lines were severed, their leaders shaken, and their confidence shattered. Alejandro knew that the battle was far from over, but this victory, though temporary, was a crucial one. He had sent a message: the Veracruz Circle was still standing, and anyone who doubted his power would pay the price. The war was not over, but Alejandro had proven that he would never give up, no matter how high the stakes. As the days passed after their swift attack on the Gulf Cartel, Alejandro felt the brief surge of victory begin to fade into the harsh reality of the ongoing war. Despite the cartel's temporary setback, the war was far from over. In fact, the Gulf Cartel's response was already in the works, and Alejandro knew that their retaliation would be swift, brutal, and unforgiving. The battle for Veracruz had entered a new, even more dangerous phase. Alejandro couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. In the weeks following the strike, Alejandro's forces remained on high alert. They reinforced their positions along the most vulnerable smuggling routes, prepared for a potential counterattack that would come from the cartel, and kept a careful watch on the movements of their enemies. The tension was palpable. His men, once fired up by the surprise attack, were starting to feel the weight of the war drag them down. The constant threat of violence, the pressure of survival, and the mounting casualties were taking their toll on morale. Alejandro had seen men who once fought with unflinching resolve begin to show signs of doubt. The endless cycle of bloodshed was wearing on everyone, even those who had once been true believers in the cause. In the midst of this growing unrest, Alejandro found himself retreating into his thoughts more often, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The violence had always been a part of the game, but now it seemed to have consumed him. The ambition that had once fueled him now felt like a double-edged sword, propelling him into deeper conflicts, into more risk, and further from the life he once imagined. He had built an empire, but at what cost? He wondered, not for the first time, whether the price of power was worth the toll it had taken on him and those around him. The internal struggle was something Alejandro rarely expressed to others, but it gnawed at him nonetheless. There were moments when he questioned the choices he had made, the people he had trusted, and the future he was now chasing. The brutality of the war had stolen so much from him, friends, allies, his sense of peace, and it seemed like there was no end in sight. But in this world, there was no room for hesitation, no time for self-doubt. Alejandro had to continue to push forward, for his men, for his family, and for his legacy. His thoughts were interrupted by a message from El Lobo. The Gulf Cartel was gearing up for a major offensive, and their forces were assembling along the northern borders of Veracruz. Alejandro knew this would be their largest assault yet, everything the cartel had left to give. It would be a test of everything, strength, resolve, and loyalty. Alejandro had no illusions about what this attack would mean. If they lost, it wouldn't just be the end of the Veracruz circle, it could mark the end of Alejandro himself. The news of the impending assault threw the entire circle into a frenzy. There was no more time for subtlety, no time for covert operations. This would be an all-out battle, and Alejandro needed to ensure his forces were ready. He personally oversaw the deployment of his men, directing them to critical choke points along the border where the cartel was likely to strike first. The tension in the air was almost unbearable as Alejandro gave his orders. It wasn't just a matter of defending their territory, it was a matter of survival. The night before the assault, Alejandro stood alone, gazing out at the city of Veracruz. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so, as if the whole world was holding its breath. The calm before the storm. His mind raced with plans and contingencies, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything that had led him to this moment. He had come so far, but the road ahead seemed impossible. The future felt uncertain, and the possibility of failure loomed over him like a dark cloud. Yet, deep down, Alejandro knew that this was the life he had chosen. There was no turning back. His empire, for all its flaws, was his creation. It had been built on ambition, sacrifice, and blood. To lose it now would be to lose everything. But to win, to defeat the Gulf Cartel in this final, decisive battle, could that bring him peace? Or would it simply lead to another round of violence, another endless war for control? As the sun began to set on Veracruz, Alejandro finally made his decision. He would fight, not just for his empire, but for his own survival. He would not let the cartel erase everything he had worked for. It was time to face the Gulf Cartel head-on, to take the fight to them and show the world that the Veracruz Circle was not just a symbol of power, it was a symbol of resilience, of defiance against those who sought to destroy him. The battle was coming, and Alejandro would not back down. The fight for his legacy, his family, and his place in the world was about to reach its climax.